Donald Trump currently leads in all of the competitive swing states ahead of the 2024 election against Kamala Harris. Now, this is only about less than a week since Joe Biden officially withdrew from the 2024 presidential race. So obviously, I think these polls are going to fluctuate. But as it stands today, Kamala Harris is really in a very similar position to Joe Biden in terms of where she stands in the various swing states. So that's what we're going to talk about in today's video. We're going to dive into the key swing state polls and really analyze where the race stands today and how things could potentially change for Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. So we're going to get to all of that in just a second. But first, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So we take a look at where I currently have the presidential race. The swing states we're going to focus on in terms of RCP are the 7 swing states that really are going to decide the election: Nevada, Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Georgia. And honestly, if you wanted to count North Carolina as an 8th, you could potentially do that as well. But, 8 states are really going to decide the presidential election. And honestly, given where I have the map now, it's really about 4 states that are going to decide the presidential election. I have Nevada in sort of the lean Republican column. So we're going to take a look at where Donald Trump and Kamala stand. And obviously, there's less polls out for Kamala versus Trump than Biden versus Trump, just because obviously the race has had such a major shakeup so recently. But the polling really hasn't changed all that much. In Nevada, for example, if we go to RCP, the latest poll we have out of the state has Donald Trump up by 10 points. Now, I certainly think that's massively underestimating Kamala Harris. That's why I've put Nevada as lean Republican. And Nevada typically does have a history of oversampling Republicans, not just in 2016, but 2018, 2022. So all of that data obviously leads me to believe that this is definitely oversampling Republican support. But, the facts remain the same, that Kamala Harris really isn't in a better position in Nevada than Joe Biden was. Joe Biden was in a very poor position in the state. If we take a look at their overall favorabilities, Joe Biden is underwater by 18 points. And if we take a look at in the state of Nevada, he's underwater by 26 points. He has a 60% disapproval rating to a 34% approval rating. If we take a look at Kamala's numbers in the state of Nevada, she's currently at negative 27 with just a 33% favorability, 60% unfavorable. So Joe Biden does slightly better in Nevada. Kamala's in a slightly worse position. If we move on down to Arizona, Trump has been polling surprisingly well in this state, especially given the fact that it was, previously thought of as sort of a leftward trending Sunbelt state. And I still think overall the state is trending towards Democrats, but, RCP currently has Donald Trump at nearly 50% in the state, Kamala at only 43.3, which gives Donald Trump a 6.4% lead. Which is the largest lead I think he's had this entire election cycle. So in Arizona, another state where I think Kamala might be more unpopular than Joe Biden. So Democrats obviously made the calculation of removing Biden because he certainly is a liability with his, failing mental health and all of that. But Kamala also has her own baggage. And it looks like, at least in the Sun Belt, she's very bad at communicating the Democratic message in a way that Joe Biden, he became the first Democrat to win Arizona in well over 20 years back in 2020. And with Georgia, he was the first Democrat to win there in 28 years. So he was obviously better in the Sun Belt overall. Now, if we take a look at Georgia, for example, I think it's a little bit different because I think Kamala might be slightly better in Georgia than Joe Biden. If we take a look at Biden's approval numbers in Georgia, he's at 33% approval. Kamala Harris is at 35%. So Georgia might be the one state in the Sun Belt where Kamala is actually more favorable than Joe Biden. That's probably because she has better numbers among black voters than Joe Biden does. And obviously Georgia has a very significant black population. It's one of the reasons why it flipped from red to blue in 2020. Black turnout was where it needed to be, and Democrats were able to get enough of the white suburban vote in order to win. Now, the polling in the state currently has Kamala losing to Trump by 4.5 points. And Georgia polls typically tend to be accurate. If we go back to 2022, the margin that Herschel Walker lost by was about the same margin that Raphael Warnock was up in the polls there. And, 2020, same thing. I think Biden was leading in the aggregate by 0.3% or 0.2%. And that's the exact margin he ended up winning the state overall. So Georgia is going to be probably one of the most important swing states, because I think that if Republicans can't do well here in a state that should still inherently favor them, Republicans did fairly well here in 2022 besides Herschel Walker. He was the only statewide Republican to lose. So if Donald Trump is able to hold a respectable margin here, that could bode well for him in other Sunbelt states like Arizona and Nevada. And Nevada actually trended to the right of where the nation was in 2020 as opposed to where it was in 2016. So even though Democrats won the state by the same exact margin, relative to the nation, Nevada actually voted to the right of the nation. So I think that bodes well for the GOP. Also the fact that Republicans actually were able to take back the governorship there, even though they lost the Senate race very narrowly. Now, if we move over to North Carolina, this is already a right-leaning sort of state, and we really only have one poll here to go off of, which has Kamala Harris down by 9 points. It was also taken back in February, so the polling in North Carolina has been pretty scant, to say the least. Now, if we take a look at Biden in North Carolina, that could give us maybe somewhat of a clue as to where Kamala Harris could be, because so far Kamala has been polling relatively close to where Joe Biden's been polling in a lot of these key states. And Trump is up in North Carolina by 5.7%. So I would just assume for the time being that Kamala is probably down by a similar margin. And North Carolina is a state where Democrats have made significant inroads in sort of the research triangle and these more upper class, urban, suburban, even ex-urban areas. It's really been Republicans holding their own in rural North Carolina and actually trending southeast and northeast North Carolina in their direction. So this is a state that's going to be incredibly close no matter who ends up winning. North Carolina has always been close since 2008. Going back to 2016, Donald Trump beat Hillary Clinton here by 3.6. And in 2020, Donald Trump beat Joe Biden here by 1.3. So I would assume if the current polls hold, and, typically polls in North Carolina tend to oversample Democrats. That's been usually the consistent trend. I believe Joe Biden was leading in North Carolina in the polls before the 2020 election, and Hillary Clinton was leading here back in 2016. The state ended up going Republican despite that, and I think in 2024 you're certainly going to see a several point margin for Donald Trump here at this point in time. So I don't know if it's going to be a 5-point margin. North Carolina is stubbornly a very close state, even though it's a red state, but I would still consider that very likely in terms of probability in the Trump column. Now, if we move up to the Rust Belt, this is where things get very interesting as well, because Donald Trump has been polling surprisingly well in the Sun Belt, but when you look at how the Sun Belt has voted over the past 2-3 decades or so, it shouldn't really be surprising because it's a relatively conservative Republican part of the state. And even though Democrats had, a slight turnaround here in 2020, the margins by which they won these states were incredibly close. Nevada was the least close to these states, and Democrats only won by 2.4. Arizona was a 0.3% margin. Georgia was 0.2. That shows you how incredibly close these states are. So if the nation is having sort of a backlash effect against Democrats governing for 4 years, Georgia and Arizona would probably be the first dominoes to fall. But the Rust Belt is really where Democrats need to focus their efforts if they want to retain the presidency, because these 3 states, one of these 3 states is likely to decide the election altogether. It's probably going to be Wisconsin, but it could be Pennsylvania as well. Republicans need one of the Rust Belt states in order to win the election, and Democrats need to basically win all 3 if they want to win the election, or hold on to Georgia and Arizona. Because if we take a look at the map right now, it's currently 226 to 257 on the Electoral College map. If we give Republicans the state of Wisconsin, for example, provided they're able to hold on to Arizona, they win with 278 electoral votes. If Democrats win Pennsylvania, Michigan, obviously that doesn't change. It stays at 260, 278. So Democrats need to either flip Arizona, Georgia, or Wisconsin. If Democrats flip Wisconsin, they're at exactly 270 electoral votes. So Democrats, based on the polling, need to sweep the Rust Belt in order to win the election, because without it, they have really no path to 270. If Republicans have the Sun Belt on lock, as it looks like they do according to the polls, Arizona, Georgia, Nevada seem to be in the lean Republican column, Democrats need to win the entire Rust Belt in order to win the presidency. So for the first time in quite a while, I would say the Democrats are the ones at a disadvantage with the Electoral College map, because right now, as it stands, Republicans are the ones who, if their numbers hold in the Sun Belt, have the built-in advantage. It's Democrats that need to sweep in order to win. Now, the silver lining for Democrats is that the Rust Belt is an ancestrally Democratic area. If we look back at 2020, these states all voted to the left of the Sun Belt states. Pennsylvania voted for Biden by 1.2, Michigan 2.8, and Wisconsin 0.6. Now, those are still incredibly close margins, which goes to show you that, to some extent, the Trump hold on rural areas in the Midwest was not just a one-time fluke. It very much is sort of a permanent realignment. These red rural counties stayed just as red, and in some cases even got redder in the 2020 election. So it goes to show you that this phenomenon of white working class voters moving to the GOP in droves isn't stopping. The only problem for Republicans is that there's only so many white working class voters in the country, and you still have to appeal to white suburban voters and other voters in order to actually win in these states. So we look at the polls in the Rust Belt. We'll start with Pennsylvania. Donald Trump currently leads Kamala Harris by 3.6, which is a pretty large margin as far as Pennsylvania is considered, and it's basically outside the margin of error. Now, if you go back to 2022, there have been examples of Republicans being overestimated here as well. Dr. Oz was actually leading in the RCP average, I believe by like 0.2, and ended up losing the race by 5 points to John Fetterman. So I would still exercise some caution, but as things are trending right now, it certainly looks good for Donald Trump in Pennsylvania. And his coalition of victory is probably going to be similar to that of 2016, running up high rural margins. And he would probably have to do better and break through in northeastern Pennsylvania. Get places like Lackawanna County down to low single digits. Get places like Luzerne County to near 20-point margins. That's what you need to win Pennsylvania. And you need to have Democrats do worse in the Philadelphia suburbs than they previously have done in order to actually win, because these counties are very populous and they're leftward trending. If we go to 2020, for example, places like Bucks County, Montgomery County, Chester County, all counties with, over 500,000 people each, trending to the left. And most of the state, especially in northeastern Pennsylvania, was trending towards the left. But western Pennsylvania was sort of trending in Trump's direction. And I think certainly in 2024 with Kamala as the Democratic nominee, I think you could potentially see more gains for Republicans in western PA than we saw even in 2020. So obviously, polling-wise, it looks good for Donald Trump in Pennsylvania. If we move on to Michigan, this has always been the closest Rust Belt state. Wisconsin, for whatever reason, always polls about neck and neck, a complete tie. But in terms of how these states actually vote, Michigan has always been the bluest of them. Donald Trump lost Michigan by 2.8 in 2020, and in 2016, he was able to win Michigan, but only won the state by 0.3. So the polling currently has Donald Trump up by 1.5. Obviously, it's still very early, but I think he also has the advantage there. Kamala Harris, I don't think, is necessarily the right Democrat to appeal to the Rust Belt. And certainly when she selects her running mate, I think one thing she's going to have to consider is somebody who can actually message effectively to the Rust Belt, because the Rust Belt is not this hyper-liberal, progressive part of the country. She actually needs to appeal to middle-of-the-road, white working-class voters, union voters. And, Democrats typically do well with union voters, but lately they've been sliding immensely with white working-class voters. Finally, we move on to Wisconsin. Donald Trump leads here by 0.7. Kamala Harris has 47.3% of the vote. This is another state that typically oversamples Democratic support. Did in 2016, did especially in 2020. But this state could ultimately decide the election. It was the closest of the Rust Belt states back in 2020. In fact, this was a closer margin than in 2016. Donald Trump got 48.8% of the vote here. So never over a majority. Donald Trump has never gotten a majority of the vote in any of the Rust Belt states, only a plurality. Joe Biden got a majority in Pennsylvania and Michigan, which goes to show you that, again, Democrats have sort of a built-in advantage in the Rust Belt, but when it comes to the Electoral College, Republicans really have the built-in advantage this time around, provided Arizona, Georgia, and Nevada are really as strong for Donald Trump as it looks like they're going to be. Anyway, that's it for today's video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification so you miss any more videos I put out. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.